So I just work my way down her back. There's lots and lots of repetitive marks. And I use that black stick here just to shape those muscles around her leg and work back into those light areas we created earlier. So I'm just constantly looking for the bigger shapes, breaking that down into smaller and smaller shapes as we come up the layers. And the paw is built up pretty similarly to the other tan areas, working from dark to light. And I continue on up the chest with some of that Blue Violet 2 and A33, just strengthening some of those highlights, the areas catching the light. And as always, give everything a good rub. So I just continue to add some texture down this front part of the dog using that A33 and also going a bit lighter with some A32. And now using some of that zingy yellow 15 to pick out some of the brighter areas on that little tan patch. So quite often as I work up the layers, the pieces of pastel I'm using are getting smaller, important for finding those sharp edges. And when I get to this stage, I'm just taking my time, noticing any little areas that need some more highlighting. It's a really slow process. I think this painting took around 50 hours to produce, so I'm never in any rush when I'm creating something. I spend more time looking at the photo reference, and although when I edit a video it makes it look like I work very quickly, there's a lot of time where I'm just sitting, looking at the painting, looking at the photo reference, choosing colours. So using that A32, I continue to find some highlights. But you can see I can really shape the dog's leg and the paw using the white and strengthening that background. Helps me get this line nice and crisp. And for the next few minutes, I go through adding some more warmth to the black areas using some of those brown earths. I also come back in with the black and strengthen, so it's a constant balance to try and find the darkest areas, make sure that they're well enough contrasted against my highlights. It's something I see quite often with people starting out in pastel, almost a fear of going too dark too soon, but you have to trust that a good pastel paper will let your lighter layers come on top of that. And if you don't have those rich darks in first, you won't have a good enough contrast between your darks and your highlights. So now I continue working on this paw area, picking out some of those brightest highlights and also clean up again around the background using my white pastel. Then I can come back in with the pastel pencil, add a little more texture down the front of the dog. I'm using quite small marks here, not leaning too heavily. And then I just darken some more of the bottom of the paw where it's sitting sunken into the blanket. So here I'm using some BE22, yet another useful brown earth tone. And I'm just bringing some of those highlights around the corner of her leg a little. Blue violet too again, that lovely light violet tone. One step up the highlights. And you notice my marks get a little smaller as I make these top marks. And for my top highlight in some of these areas, I'm using BV1. So I've gone from BV2, slightly darker blue violet, up to this top highlight. For painting any subject matter, you really need a good range of colours from dark to light, but also both warm and cool. So you need a good range of light tones that will allow you to add highlights that are in warm areas, but also highlights in your shadow areas. So you might use light tones with more blue or lilac or green in it. And in your sunlit areas, your highlights will have more yellow or peach, and that will really affect the realistic quality of your painting. So I come back to work on this paw a little more, and I thought I'd show you this in real time just to let you see some of my smaller finishing off marks. And I'm using that BE13 here. Some of my tutorials will be based on shorter projects than this one. This one's been quite a mammoth task to squeeze down into 1 hour and show you all the information I want to get across. But I hope that you'll benefit from seeing so much of this piece come together and be able to apply that to the animals that you're painting. So now I go through the finishing touches on the body. For these top highlights, I'm using BV1, sometimes some BV7, both nice cool blue violets, great highlight tones for shadow areas and also on black dogs to give that sheen. At this stage, it's all about those smaller shards of pastel with sharper edges, so I'm looking for good edges to make these top hairs with. I can also come back in through this with the black pastel, redefine some of those areas. And so I give this area a few final dark marks. You can see all the marks flowing nicely down the shape of the body. And now we're on to the second sausage. And the first task is to block in some of this dark area. So there's a lot of shadow between the two dogs, and I'm just going to speed up here while I block in a bit of the black, again using the same Faber-Castell black stick. I decided to focus this part of the tutorial on the tan dog's back area, as that demos really well how to build up the smooth coat, but also how to create a gradient of colour coming from shadow into the area that's been hit by sunlight. So I'll just name all the new colours that you're seeing. A lot of them you'll have already seen me use in the tan areas on the first dog. So this first colour, BE29, I'm just using it on its side, blocking in a good amount of colour. This makes a good base colour for this dog. I don't always block in a big amount of pastel like this, as I don't like filling up the paper too much. But in this case, it's quite good to get this base coat down. So in this next section, I'm really just getting some base layers down using some nice rich RE12, some BE6 darker brown in the shadow areas, and then bringing in some of our familiar yellow 15, BE11 and yellow 10, that slightly zingier one, and saving those for the areas that I know later on will have those highlights. So you can see in the photo reference, she's got these wrinkles down her body where she's turning around to look at us. So I need to create real depth and darkness within those wrinkles, but also find where the light is hitting them from above. So this light colour that I've been using to pick out that part of her back that's next to the window is BE19. And now this richer brown earth tone, nice orange warmth to it. This is BE10. And I'm really looking at this area just to the bottom of the shadow where it comes out of shadow into the light. And there's a real warmth on this area, and I want to create that gradient going from right in the shadow to where our brightest highlights will be. So like with the black dog, it's just a case of building up these layers gradually, not leaning too heavily and filling the paper too soon, rubbing each of your layers well into the paper. And so I take another go over with the black pastel, just strengthening that shadow area and starting to add a bit of texture down the back. Then I come back in with some of that rich BE11 just to fill in some of these gaps, add more warmth and depth. And now with that lovely warm BE10, I'm just starting to pick out some of the highlights here on these wrinkles. As always, rubbing those marks well in just softens it into the layers below. You don't lose very much of your definition. That will of course depend a little on the pastel paper that you're using. Some of them allow you to smudge a bit more than others. This is why I like velour for painting animals especially, as you can keep each of your layers quite well defined. Other pastel papers, often used for painting animals, Pastel Matte is also quite good. It holds many layers and you can get quite a lot of detail on there. Really the best thing I can recommend when you're starting out with pastel is to try and buy some individual sheets of different pastel papers, as they all behave quite differently, so it's good to experiment a little in the beginning. In terms of the colours that you'll need to get going, 20 or 30 of the right colours will take you really far, and then over time you'll add to this collection, adding individual sticks now and again. You don't always have to have the exact colour that I mention, but you'll be able to go away and find something that's close enough to do the job. So I'm just starting now with some BE13, making these smaller marks, working my way down towards this highlighted area. I don't want to go too light too soon with my highlight colours. You can see I only get a tone or two lighter each time I put a new layer on, which gives it that extra depth. So I'm just continuing with this BE10, picking out some of those warmer areas. And then I come back in again with that black pastel, really strengthen that area between the two dogs. So I just continue to add more layers, always thinking about where that light is coming from, where the warmest, richest tones are, and just with some small marks, I'm layering in more colour. Also starting to think about where it starts to get a little darker at the bottom of the dog. And I use some of that BE29 and some BE16. So all the time, I'm just making these small marks, quite uniformed around the shape of the dog, making sure that the marks I'm making follow that flow of the fur. And again I come back in with the black pastel, constantly looking to darken those wrinkly areas and also that area behind the dog, which will help me figure out how light to go with my highlights. And then I spend the next few moments just dotting in more of those same colours that I've been using. Now, as with the black and tan dog, I want to make sure that the areas that are being hit by the light have the most detail, and those areas in the shadow can afford to have a little less detail. So using a nice light tone, BE13, I start to add in some smaller marks across the back in the area where the most light is hitting. Now this area takes a long time to build up, and I use several layers to do it, so each time I'll show you the process at the beginning, showing you the type of mark I'm putting. It's always these small thin marks going in the direction of the fur, and then I spend quite a long time applying that all over nice and even. You can be quite bold with your colour choices, so something even as vibrant as yellow 10 or yellow 9 works really lovely on this type of coat. When you're applying it in the lower layers, then the next layers that come on top of that seem to blend into that, and you still get some of that lovely vibrance shining through. So in the photo reference, you can see that this side of the dog really does tilt away from the light. However, there are still highlights on that side of the dog. So how do you choose the colour for over there? I always try to think of the colour of highlight that I've used in the sunlit area. In this case, it's going to be yellowy light tones. So I want to try and go with the opposite colour of that, the complementary colour. And here I'm using Blue Violet 1, that really light violet, and it's great as a highlight to use in the shadow areas. And I'm using the same type of mark, just layering that on, and as always, following the shape of the dog's structure. So now I want to work on some of this highlighted area underneath the third dog's chin. I'm using light 4 here, which is a very slightly peachy light tone. It's a bit brighter than the last highlight layer that I applied, and it will be the next highlight layer that I apply down the dog's back. So the same as before, these small marks, all following the direction of the dog's back. I covered this area so many times, so I've time-lapsed you through quite a lot of it. As you can imagine, these areas took quite a long time just slowly layering this up, making sure each layer is nicely blended into the one below. So I come back in and add some more of the darker browns to this shadow side. As I've added some highlights to the right side of the dog, it has shown me that this side needs to be a little darker with a little more contrast. I then feather some of those blue-violet marks back over the top of that. And that really begins to look like that side is in the shadow. So now I just continue layering in more of the rich browns, trying to judge how far down I need to come with this shadow. I know at this stage it's nowhere near dark enough. And I keep bringing it down further towards this back leg. Trying to find some of those little creases following down from all those wrinkles. So now I come back with some of the BE16, a slightly duskier orange, so not quite as zingy or vibrant as the ones I'm using around the highlight areas. So I'm using this in that shadow area just to pick out the tops of some of those wrinkles in there. and they look very bright at the moment, but again they'll work into the paper, and I also need to make more areas around them a bit darker, so they do stand out a little too much at the moment. So the next layer up of the highlights on the back, this time I'm using grey 27, and again it's a long process adding lots of small marks, but this time focusing on a smaller area within that bigger highlighted area. So this is really the brightest area, that one point where the light is really bouncing off. And again I can come back in with the black pastel pencil and that black pastel just to strengthen these darker areas. As you work, the dustiness of the lighter pastels tends to go over your dark areas, so you always want to go back through the painting and strengthen those dark areas and the light areas too, so it's a constant balancing of the two. So now with some of the zingier yellowy oranges, I go back through and add some warmth. I also want to start to blend the edges of this highlighted area into the shadow area a little more. So I don't want there to be quite as hard a line here. I would like this to be a nice smooth gradient from shadow to light. So you'll see me work around the edges of this area now, just softening and softening with layer after layer. So for the next moment or so, I dart around with some BE8, this light orangey brown earth. I search for all those little highlights, strengthen them, and I also work with the black pastel to darken that area in between the two dogs. So we're on to the home stretch with this, and one of the last little techniques I wanted to show you in real time here. I'm trying to taper these wrinkles down just with a little bit of highlight colour, and I'm using little diagonal strokes, so it's almost like building up a little bit of cross hatching, just very gently making some light marks and then rubbing them in to the layers underneath, following the line of each wrinkle as it comes down. And then again, coming in with more vibrant tones, doing the same thing, just softening at those edges and adding little vibrant splashes where I can see them. I really hope you've enjoyed this first hour-long tutorial. It's been a learning curve for me to make, so I am sure that over the coming months I will get quicker and better at them. The main thing for me is to show you in detail all the techniques that go into all the different types of marks you can make with pastel, all the different effects you can get, and hopefully you'll be able to take this away and apply it to your own projects. There will be tutorials where you'll be able to paint along with what I'm doing, but for the likes of this one, hopefully this will come in useful when you are faced with an animal with such a smooth coat. So at this point, I do quite a useful and often satisfying thing to do, especially when you're trying to judge how bright to go with your highlights. I fill in some of this dark area in the dog behind. Just having that block of black there will really help me see how bright I need to go with the edges of the tan dog. So I just keep going over this area layer by layer, gradually building up the depth in the coat. I'd really love to hear your feedback on this tutorial. It's my first attempt at something so long, so I would love to hear your thoughts, and any ideas for future tutorials, do leave me some comments in the thread below. And don't forget, I'll also be making other instructional videos covering everything from pastel storage tips to preparing your board for painting. And one of the final things I do on this top layer, in the shadow area, I just use some brown pastel pencil just to redefine some of those individual hairs. It doesn't have to be very precise, just adding a bit more texture back into those lighter colours. So we're coming close to the end now, and I want to thank you for becoming a patron and for making it the whole way through the first tutorial. I hope you do lots of homework from this, and I hope to see you for next month's tutorial. I'll be demoing on 2 beautiful schnauzers next month, where I'll show you how to paint that type of fur that seems to sprout out from the dog's face. So happy painting, and I'll see you next time.